What about, so that's all about early life. What about as we age? And it's becoming clear that the microbiome it plays a key role at the extremes of life. And so this is some work from my colleagues in Cork in the APC Microbiome Institute, led by Paul O'Toole, where they were interested in what happens to the elderly microbiome. So they took almost 180 subjects and followed them over a number of years and looked at their microbiome. And they found that they could really correlate changes in the microbiome with functional outcomes in the elderly, like frailty, cognitive function, inflammation. But moreover, they were able to chart some of these people transitioned from living in the community to being in a rehab to being in a nursing home. And they were able to show that as they transitioned, their microbiome also changed and their functional outcome also changed. And so it tells us that, very much about the changing places that we live can influence it. But then they looked at what are the factors that are influencing this. And this was the really neat part, was that it was actually diet. That the diversity of the diet, that people in the community had a much more diverse diet. They had a much more diverse microbiome. The functional readout in terms of short-chain fatty acids were higher. They were performed better in a lot of the tests that they did. And so that a diverse diet gives a diverse microbiome, gives a healthier outcome, is the take-home message from this. And whereas those that were often in nursing homes had a very processed diet, very much the same everyday type of thing. And this has huge public health implications for how we treat our elderly and how we treat them in nursing homes in terms of the factors that will influence their microbiome. The same group just had a paper published this week on the Mediterranean diet and showing how it could also, in adults, could also positively affect the microbiome. So the interface between diet, microbiome, and health outcomes is going to be a very important one into the future. So we were interested in the elderly and in terms of how they manage stress. Because as I said, there are lots of different factors that stress will induce at different time points. And so in this schematic, we point out what's going on in the aging brain and the aging body, and we have the whole process of inflammation that's very well described. We get neuroinflammation, we get glial cell activation, blood-brain barrier breakdown, peripheral immune cell infiltration. All this happens in normal aging process. But what happens if we start putting chronic stress on top of this? And the convergence between stress and aging is, as we describe here, is adding fuel to the fire and may give rise to some of the psychopathologies that we see that are quite distinct in the aging population, such as cognitive impairment, anxiety, depression, and social isolation, which is very well seen. So we're trying to understand that right now, and we have a number of studies ongoing looking at behavioral changes in aged animals and correlating it to changes at the microbiome. Because what we did here was, for the first time, we put the brain-gut axis into this schematic, and maybe that by through diet or through other ways we can influence the microbiome to change or slow down this aging process. And it's not a new idea. So I thought I would share with you throughout the talk some of the work of this Nobel Prize winner from over 100 years ago, Eli Metchnikoff. So Metchnikoff shared the Nobel Prize with Paul Ehrlich, and he won it for his work in immunology. He discovered the macrophage, and he was working at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And it's kind of timely because yesterday, most of you may have known, the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology was shared by three people, one of which was an Irish guy who worked on mining microbes. Bill Campbell, for the discovery of ivermectin. And so what Metchnikoff was studying was the immune system. But as is the case often with Nobel Prize winners, when they mature in their years, they can come up with what are then seen as somewhat crazy ideas. And so he left the macrophage behind and started studying or thinking about what we eat. And he came up with the concept that people in certain parts of Eastern Europe and Bulgaria, that they ate a lot of lactic acid bacteria. And in doing so, they lived longer. So he's written it in this book, The Prolongation of Life by Diet. Now, some of the rationale behind what he was doing has been very much disproved, but the concept that by microorganisms, by probiotics, and he's the father of probiotic research, that you could prolong life, is still seen as a little bit out there. And then you start to see, well, what about Craig Ventnor, who has done so much in terms of sequencing, and he has a new venture called Human Longevity. And the Human Longevity Project is going to look at the genetic basis of aging. But it's not just the human genes that they're looking at. They're also looking at the microbiome, as indicated in this talk that Brad Perkins gave earlier this year. And they're looking at the metabolome, what these microorganisms are producing, and looking at the influence of this. And that maybe Metchnikoff was right in understanding how aging process occurs, and that there is convergence in this.